Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we begin with silence and longing. In Mirkwood, a king marks centuries of absence, and across the wide fields of Rohan, a lone elf seeks the shelter of trees. Rest your thoughts, let the quiet guide you, and step with me into the first chapter of our tale. 2,000 years later, Thranduil stared at the map of Middle-earth hanging on his study's wall. On the map were random red dots. There weren't many of them, only a small handful. Most of them were in the kingdoms of men. 2 were in the forest near Rivendell. There was one in the forest of Lothlorien, but there were none near Mirkwood, as if he was avoiding it. The dots were sightings of his son, but there hadn't been nearly as many sightings in the last 1,000 years or so. Legolas got smarter and quicker over the years, being seen less than before. The king of Mirkwood sighed sadly. When he heard of his son's disappearance, he had almost faded away. It was the knowledge that Legolas was still alive that kept him from leaving to the halls of Mandos. It gave him the determination to find him and bring him home. Thranduil hadn't stopped blaming himself for Legolas's disappearance. He ran away on his own free will because Thranduil was avoiding him. He didn't feel his Ada's love during a time he needed it the most. He needed to hold his son in his arms and tell him how much he loved him. 2,000 years. He missed his son's whole childhood. His child, his only child, was gone. Legolas was one of the youngest elves in all elven kingdoms. When he went missing, everyone felt the blow and started the search for him. The search had only lasted a few hundred years, but Thranduil knew they were still keeping their eyes open for the missing prince. Thranduil turned away from the map and to the window. He could see the tops of the trees of Mirkwood, and a little beyond to the fields. Beyond the fields, misty mountains, which separated them from Rivendell, were tiny specks in the distance. His son was out there, somewhere. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Enter," he called out. Captain Irinian entered and bowed. He looked tired, but long travel could do that to an elf. "Captain Irinian, how goes in Rivendell? You were gone a lot longer than I had expected." Captain Irinian nodded. "I apologize, King Thranduil. Lord Elrond had asked us to stay to represent the Greenwood realm in a great council." Thranduil sat up. "A great council of what kind, Captain?" "The One Ring of Sauron has been found and brought to Rivendell with a young hobbit. The council was to decide its fate." Thranduil looked away in surprise. He waved his captain to the chair across his desk. "Sit, Irinian, and tell me of this council. Did you inform the council of Gollum's escape?" Irinian sat down on the offered chair and nodded. Lord Elrond was concerned, but, understandably, had more pressing issues to be concerned about. Thranduil nodded in agreement. Naturally. What was the council's decision? A few months later, Legolas traveled across the land of Rohan at a slow pace. It had been a number of years since he traveled through Rohan. He was now remembering why. He hated the lack of trees. Rohan was mostly fields, which made them the Horse Lord people. Its open space made it perfect for raising and riding horses. He was on his way to the closest forest, which was Fangorn Forest. He paused and looked towards the lowering Sunday. His eyes narrowed with displeasure. Something was going on in the land of Rohan. It was like a dark hand rising over the land. Something was coming. It gave him discomfort. The poison was already injected. Now it was spreading. He had felt it the moment he entered Rohan. He should have left Rohan as soon as he felt it. He turned away from the setting sun and continued walking, increasing his pace. He wanted to reach the safety of the forest before resting. It was too dangerous to sleep in the open with orcs about. He already forgone 5 days of sleep and an elf body could only carry on for so long without rest. Luckily enough, he was able to see the Fangorn forest in the distance, only a few hours' walk. As he walked, he once again thought he shouldn't have come to Rohan. Not only was the land a plain with very little trees, and the land of Rohan was covered in evil, but Rohan was much too close to Isengard. He shook his head at his own stupidity. He had heard many rumors of Saruman's treachery and seen evidence on the orcs. The White Hand, a sign of Saruman. The last thing he wanted to do was attract Saruman's attention. A few hours later, he reached Fangorn Forest. Much to his relief, the sun had gone down, leaving the land in a dark veil. As soon as Legolas entered the forest, his shoulders slouched in relief. The tension in his body was relaxed. He paused a moment and closed his eyes. The trees whispered and groaned with age and anger. He frowned. He felt young again within the ancient forest. This was not his first time in Fangorn Forest. He came once before, many years ago, and stayed for almost a month. As he glanced around, he could tell it hadn't changed a bit in the last few hundred years. Legolas walked farther into the forest before kneeling before one of the trees. He reached out and placed his hand on the bark. He could feel the anger and pain, and he sighed. "I'm sorry, my friend, for the pains in your past," he whispered. The tree responded with a quiet groan. "Please grant me shelter and peaceful passage within your realm." He waited for the tree's response before giving him a nod of thanks. "I thank you, my friend. I will not linger long. I promise. Do you mind if I rest against your bark? It has been many days since I had last slept," he asked. The wind blew. The trees groaned, warning Legolas of a disturbance at the forest's edge. Legolas looked in the direction the warning came from, with narrowed eyes. "I shall check it out," he said to the trees as he gathered his supplies and slipped his bow off his back, getting it ready, just in case. Stealthily, Legolas headed towards the edge of the forest, southwest from where he came in from. He hesitated for a second, realizing he was rather close to the gap of Rohan, and more alarmingly, Isengard. Whatever the disturbance was, it must have been coming to or from the darkened towers of Saruman. With that in mind, and knowing he had to be careful, Legolas quietly placed his bag of supplies on the ground, his eyes remaining alert and focused in front of him. He needed to be stealthy and quick. The bag might get in the way if he had to run for it. He reached back and pulled an arrow out of his quiver. After securing his arrow on his bow, he continued forward. He climbed a tree at the forest's edge before peering out. He cursed silently to himself. "Orcs!" he spat out. And Uruk-hai. There were too many of them to single-handedly fight, but he felt the same anger the trees felt when he saw that they had chopped up branches for their firewood. Legolas doubted they had asked for permission or thanked the trees. However, there was nothing he could do but sit and watch. Legolas sat comfortably on the branch of the tree and began his long watch. The group of orcs and Uruk-hai were arguing about something. Legolas closed his eyes to listen better. Food. They were arguing about food. "What about their legs? They don't need those," one of the orcs said. Legolas opened his eyes. They? Who? Prisoners? Orcs did not take prisoners unless Saruman ordered them to, and he wouldn't order it unless the person was important. He studied the group of orcs more carefully, trying to pick out any prisoners. There were too many orcs, and the prisoners seemed to have been somewhere in the middle. They must be small, or they were lying down, because he could not see them. "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!" an Uruk-hai yelled to his companions. Legolas winced when their loud yells of approval rang through the night. He watched as all the orcs seemed to gather in a pile to fight for a bite of meat. Legolas's sharp eyes caught movement on the ground. crawling away from the pile. He sat up and leaned forward for a better look. Children? There were 2 of them crawling on their elbows towards the forest, trying to escape. What did Saruman want with children? Were they the children of some leader he wished to see suffer? Whatever the case may be, Saruman would not be getting them. Legolas's ears twitched as a sound of hooves pounding on the ground momentarily took his attention. Help would arrive soon. He now had an advantage. He turned back to the children to find an orc standing over them, looking fierce and hungry. He pulled back his arrow and took aim. He let it loose just as the riders of the mark came crashing into the throng of orcs and uruks. He hit his target and quickly pulled out another arrow. He shot one arrow after another, hitting his target each time. He heard a sound underneath him and glanced down just in time to see the 2 children run past the tree. He narrowed his eyes when he saw they were being followed by a single orc. He glanced at the battle. The riders of Rohan still could use his help, but he looked back into the forest where the children were being followed. They needed his help. Legolas touched the trunk of the tree. "Protect them," he whispered, "until I am able to give them aid." The tree groaned and comforted. Legolas turned back to the battle and pulled out an arrow. The arrow hit its target, killing an orc that was about to sneak up on the rider's leader. A half an hour later, Legolas observed the dwindling battle. The riders of the mark were just finishing off the last few stragglers. It looked like his job was over here. He turned his back to the battle and pulled out another arrow. He just got another job, protecting the children. He jumped off the branch and landed soundlessly on the ground. It was time to hunt an orc. He rushed ahead, remaining quiet as he let the trees lead him to the enemy. A little while later, he could see the orc up ahead. He paused and looked around his surroundings. He needed to find a good spot to strike. "Did we lose him?" "I think we lost him," Legolas heard one of the children say from somewhere ahead of him. Knowing they had not lost the orc, he quickly raced ahead and climbed on top of a branch. He could see the children lying on the ground, crawling away from the orc that had reappeared from the bushes. He pulled back his arrow and let go. It penetrated the orc right in the head, and the children let out a startled scream. "Be not afraid, children," Legolas called out. "I am but a friend." He jumped off the branch and walked over to the fallen orc, well aware of the children's eyes upon him. He kicked the orc lightly, checking to see if it was truly dead. It didn't move. He nodded, satisfied and pleased with his aim. "An elf," one of them whispered with awe. Legolas stood before them and finally got his first real glance at the children. They were short, smaller than a full-sized dwarf. One of them had dirty blonde curly hair, and the other had golden wispy hair. He looked at the travel clothes and down at their bare, hairy feet. He glanced back at their faces with unhidden amusement. "I see I was mistaken. I had thought you were children of men, but I see before me 2 grown hobbits. Forgive me." His voice seemed to shake them from their wonderment. The hobbit with the curly hair took a step forward and spoke up. "Thank you, Master Elf, for saving us. I'm Meriadoc Brandybuck, son of Saradoc Brandybuck of the Shire, but you can call me Mary." He turned to the other hobbit. "This is my cousin, Peregrine Took, son of Paladin Took too, and you can call him Pippin." Pippin gave him an enthused wave that made him chuckle. He nodded his head in a greeting. "I am Legolas." They stared at him, and he knew they were waiting for the usual customary introduction. But how could he give it when he himself didn't know his father's name or his homeland? To distract them from asking, he quickly spoke. "I am curious as to why Saruman would want 2 hobbits, such as yourselves." At their wide-eyed expression, he quickly reassured them. "However, I am sure your business is your own. I don't make a habit of knowing the business of others. Ah, young Legolas, I heard you've entered the wood once again. A familiar, drawn-out voice came from behind him. The two hobbits gasped in fear as their eyes stared upwards. Legolas smiled gleefully, remembering the voice from the last time he was in Fangorn Forest. He turned around. "Treebeard greetings, my friend," he said to the tall, stiff-limbed Ent. "Ne Sion Luim," he said in his native tongue. "It has been too long." "Has it really?" Treebeard asked, before he saw the hobbits. He suddenly glared at them. "Orcs!" he growled, mistaken them for orcs. Legolas quickly stepped in front of the hobbits and held out his hand to the Ent. "Not orcs, Treebeard. They are hobbits of the Shire, leagues northeast from here." "Hobbits? Never heard of a hobbit before. Sounds like orc mischief to me." He felt the hobbits huddle closer to him, fearful of the talking tree's wrath. "Treebeard, trust me. They are not orcs, but hobbits. I'm not surprised you never heard of them. They hardly ever travel out of the comfort of their shire. To see one away from their home is rather rare. They are a peaceful, simple creature, Treebeard," Legolas tried to reassure. "They are not here to harm the woods, but to take sanctuary. Will you grant them refuge, my friend?" Treebeard rocked back in thought. I'll let the White Wizard decide their fate." Legolas blinked in surprise, and he heard one of the hobbits whisper, "Saruman," in horror. "Treebeard, you mustn't allow Saruman get his hands on them. Don't bring them to Saruman, I beg you." Treebeard reared back in shock. "Saruman? No, not Saruman, young elf. Saruman doesn't enter the wood anymore. Saruman is the only White Wizard. If not Saruman, then who do you speak of?" Legolas asked. "The one who came back, young Legolas. He is no longer gray. He became white to help where Saruman would not." Legolas took in the words, but couldn't figure out what the Ent meant. He looked up at his tall friend. "Do you trust him?" "Trust him with the bark on my limbs. I do, young elf," Treebeard answered. Legolas nodded in agreement and turned to the two hobbits. "I want you to go with Treebeard. I trust him. He will not lead you astray. I believe him when he says he is not taking you to Saruman." Pippin gave him a wide-eye look. "You're not going with us, Master Legolas?" Legolas sighed and shook his head. "I'm afraid not, Pippin. I have to go back for my pack and get some much-needed rest. It's been well over 5 days since I last slept. It is needed." Merry nodded. "We understand, Master Legolas." Legolas chuckled. "There is no need to call me Master, young Merry. I am still quite a young elf with no title to my name. I am simply Legolas. If you have need of me," he glanced up at Treebeard. "Treebeard will know how to reach me." He gave the hobbits a gentle smile. "I will remain within the trees for an unforeseen amount of time. It depends on how long I rest. Safe journey, my friends." "Goodbye, Legolas, and thank you," Merry said before climbing on the offered limb of the Ent. Pippin waved to him before following his cousin. Legolas watched them go before heading back to his supplies. He really hoped nothing else would prevent him from resting. Luckily, there wasn't. "We are no spies," Aragorn assured to the man he recognized as Éomer, King Theoden's nephew. Éomer turned back to him, and Aragorn continued. "We track a party of Uruk-hai westward across the plain. They have taken 2 of our friends captive." Éomer's eyes shifted with recognition. "The Uruks are destroyed. We slaughtered them during the night." The horses that surrounded them shifted, as if they understood Éomer's words and remembered. The riders of the mark quickly calmed them. Gimli spoke up quickly, hope in his voice. "But there were 2 hobbits. Did you see 2 hobbits with them?" he asked, holding up 2 fingers to emphasize his point. Aragorn stepped forward, realizing Éomer may not know what a hobbit looked like. They would be small, only children to your eyes. Éomer for a split second looked uncomfortable as he briefly turned away. He turned back to Aragorn with no emotion on his face. We left none alive. He turned and pointed to smoke rising in the distance. We piled the carcasses and burned them. Gimli looked down with despair. Dead? Éomer looked down. I am sorry. However, he paused and turned to one of his men. He held out a hand. The arrow, he ordered. We were not alone in fighting the Uruks, he told Aragorn. How so? Aragorn asked. An arrow was passed to Éomer's hand, and he showed it to Aragorn. This was found in few of the bodies. There was someone else there firing from the woods. Perhaps he knows the fate of your hobbit friends. Aragorn took the arrow and studied it. It looks like an elven-made arrow from the Greenwood realm. He pointed to a tiny craved leaf near the end of the arrow. That's the mark of Mirkwood, and the wood is not painted. But he balanced the arrow on his finger to check the weight, and fingered the feathers softly. These are not the feathers or the wood the warriors of Mirkwood uses. It almost looks like someone trying to duplicate Mirkwood's arrows. He looked at Éomer like he had the answers he sought, but Éomer shook his head. None of my men saw him. He stayed in the forest and must have left soon after or just before the end of the battle. Look for the owner of the arrow, and he might be able to tell you your friend's fate, where I cannot. But do not trust to hope. It has forsaken these lands. He took the arrow back and let out a whistle. Hasufel, Arad. 2 horses were led to him, and he handed the reins over to Aragorn. May these horses bear you to better fortune than their former masters. Farewell. He placed his helmet back on his head and jumped back on his horse. We ride north, he yelled to his men before leading them off, leaving the Aragorn and Gimli with the 2 horses. Gimli stared at the 4-legged creatures and shook his head. I am not getting on that thing. Aragorn opened his mouth to argue, but decided against it. Instead, he unsaddled Arad. You'll ride with me, Gimli, he assured. Horses will get us there faster and will rest our tired legs. He slapped Arad in the behind, and the horse reared up before galloping away. Aragorn watched him go, hoping the horse would be all right on its own. He jumped on Hasufel and helped Gimli up behind him. Let's ride. Chapter 2. Legolas was rudely awakened late the next morning by a foot kicking him in the leg. Gimli, stop. He heard just before he reached for his dagger and slashed it into the air towards the offender, with speed only an elf could do. A clash of metal against metal as someone blocked his dagger with a sword. It was only then did Legolas saw his offender and his companion. Before him was a long-bearded, auburn-haired dwarf with blue eyes and an axe in his hand. He was staring wide-eyed at the 2 crossed blades in front of his face. Legolas followed the sword to a man. The man was tall, with dark, shoulder-length dark hair and honest gray eyes. He held himself with authority, like a lord of the land, a leader, an honorable leader. I apologize for my friend. He still needs to learn some manners, the man said, giving the dwarf a hard look. And I apologize for almost killing your companion. One could never be too careful these days. Legolas responded calmly before pulling his dagger away. The man nodded in agreement before sheathing his weapon. Legolas sat up and sheathed his dagger as well. Is there something I can help you with? The man nodded. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn. He nodded to the dwarf. This is Gimli, son of Gloin. We seek 2 friends of ours that were captured by the Uruk-hai, who was camped just outside the border of the forest. Legolas stared at them. The name Aragorn did not strike him as familiar, but the name Arathorn did. His mind struggled to remember why. He raised his head in recognition as the answer came to him. He had met a man by the name of Arathorn almost 100 years ago. Surely it couldn't be the same Arathorn. Not unless he eyed the man claiming to be the son of Arathorn, trying to determine if he spoke honestly. Were they really friends? Or were they allied with Saruman? Please tell us they weren't accidentally killed by the king's riders, Aragorn said, his eyes opened to his emotion. It was that emotion that helped Legolas determine they were truly friends. He didn't see deceit in his eyes. He smiled. You speak of Merry and Pippin, do you not? Gimli stepped forward excitedly, seemingly forgetting he was in the company of an elf. You've seen them? They are well? Legolas nodded. Yes, they are well. I entrusted their care to Treebeard, an Ent. He said he would take them to see a white wizard. Before he could explain, he didn't mean Saruman. The two whipped out their weapons. Saruman, Gimli growled. Knew we couldn't trust you, elf, he spat out. Calm yourselves, he said, not looking concerned by the weapons pointed at him. I did not say Saruman. Treebeard promised me he was not taking them to Saruman, and I trust his word. He said he was taking him to see a different white wizard. Aragorn tilted his head to the side to show he was listening, but he didn't lower his sword. I don't understand any more than you do. Treebeard told me the wizard came back to do what Saruman could not do. Did he say anything else? Aragorn questioned. He was eyeing him with suspicion, his body tense and ready to attack if needs be. Legolas ignored his caution, knowing it was wise to be wary of strangers. Legolas paused in thought and nodded. He said something about the wizard being no longer gray. I don't understand his riddles, and didn't bother asking what he meant. As I said, I trust him, and if he trusts this white wizard, then I shall as well. Aragorn finally lowered his weapon and placed a hand on Gimli, a signal for him to lower his as well. He did with obvious reluctance. May you bring us to this Treebeard, or, better yet, this white wizard? The man asked. His hand remained at his side, close to his sword, and his eyes kept that guarded look. Legolas stood up. I never met the white wizard, nor have an idea where to locate him, but I may be able to locate Treebeard, if he is not otherwise occupied elsewhere. He knelt down and picked up his pack, bow, and quiver of arrows. I appreciate your willingness to help us. Aragorn dragged the sentence into a question. Legolas glanced up and smiled in embarrassment. Oh, I apologize. I seem to have forgotten to introduce myself. My name is Legolas. He turned from them before they could ask him any personal questions. Treebeard usually resides over here, he said, walking in that direction. He heard the two following behind him. Legolas, where do you hail from? Aragorn asked. I did not expect to see an elf this far from the Elven Kingdoms. He was fishing for information, Legolas knew, trying to figure out if he was trustworthy. Legolas paused as his mind struggled to come up with a good enough answer that wouldn't bring about more questions. I like to travel. I've traveled my whole life, he said, ignoring the question. I like to travel, he repeated in his head. Did he truly like to travel? Or did he just know nothing else but traveling? He never stayed in one spot for more than a few months, and that was saying something for an elf. Time was different for an elf compared to men. Would he like to stop and settle down somewhere? Yes. He would like to go home with loved ones, a family. He was just lost. Didn't know where home was, and there was no one to tell him. He supposed he could go to one of the Elven Kingdoms and ask for help. Someone with a reputation like Lord Elrond and Lady Galadriel could surely help him. But the forest of Lorien frightened him, that voice in his head. He would never return there, and how could Lord Elrond help him? It wasn't like he knew every elf in every elven kingdom. How would he know of a single family missing their son? As for Mirkwood, the forest alone kept him from entering it, and how would their king help him? He certainly didn't know more than Lord Elrond. It sounds like you are getting weary of a traveler's life, Aragorn noted. Will you be returning home soon to settle? Legolas touched the bark of a tree they were passing. He felt its ache. It was an ache he felt, but for a different reason. Yes, I would like to, he said in a wistful tone. How about you, Aragorn, son of Arathorn? Where do you hail from? He asked, trying to get the topic off of him. Aragorn walked beside him as he answered, not hesitating as Legolas did. I was raised in Rivendell, but I left and became a ranger of the north. Legolas glanced sideways at him. A Dunedain? He guessed. It would make sense. He had met his father 100 years ago. If his heritage was of the Dunedain, it would explain how that was possible. Aragorn threw him a surprised look, and his body tensed, but he nodded. Saisa omentienle, Legolas said in Elvish. Aragorn nodded his head in agreement. You must be a traveling soul as well. Do you wish to settle down? Legolas asked curiously. Pleasure meeting you. This time Aragorn did hesitate to answer, but Legolas had no knowledge of what conflicts that question may have brought. I will just have to see where the road takes me. The man was a very careful man, Legolas realized. He had answered the question without answering the question. Legolas chuckled. If I knew I could have answered your question thusly, I would have. How much further? Gimli complained from behind them, interrupted their small talk. Legolas glanced back with a smile. Extremely close, Master Dwarf. He looked forward and paused, his new companion stopping as well. He glanced around the area. It doesn't appear he is here. I apologize. When you say close, you really meant close, Gimli murmured under his breath. Now what? I don't know how to help you beyond this point, Legolas admitted as they circled the area for direction. He felt the man eyeing his back and knew he was wondering if Legolas had fooled them. Which direction did Treebeard take the hobbits? Aragorn asked, coming up beside him. Gimli stepped closer to them to hear the answer. The man glanced around the ground floor with the observant eyes of a tracker. However, Treebeard's tracks would have been all over the place, and this wasn't where the Ent had stumbled upon Legolas with the hobbits. Legolas was not paying attention. The trees were whispering to him. He narrowed his eyes in concentration and took a step forward. The sun rays floated into the woods between the shaking leaves. The wind floated from the east, whistling by the branches and leaves of the trees. The wind seemed to have carried the voices of the trees to him. Someone was coming. His keen eyes searched the woods around them. Man Senech Legolas, Aragorn whispered in Elvish. What do you see, Legolas? The white wizard approaches, Legolas answered in the common tongue, for Gimli's sake. He gave a slight head tilt to their right, indicating that was the direction the wizard was coming from. Aragorn stepped closer to him. Are you able to tell if it is Saruman or the new white wizard? He whispered. Legolas shook his head. I never met a single wizard in my life. I wouldn't be able to tell. Aragorn sighed indecisively. We don't want to attack a potential ally, but we can't give Saruman time to cast a spell on us, he said, voicing his dilemma. What do you wish to do? Legolas asked, surprising himself by asking Aragorn, as if he was his leader. Aragorn sighed. I hope the white wizard would understand if we attack. He paused in indecision before speaking his mind. On your mark, Legolas, he said, entrusting Legolas to know when to strike, being the only one who could sense the wizard's coming. His sudden show of trust threw Legolas for a second. He blinked. His attention veered away from the approaching wizard. He stared at the man beside him in confusion. Why was he trusting him? The man stared back at him, his eyes showing Legolas he was taking a risk to trust him. That brought him back to the current situation. He turned back to the forest, not waiting to lose that fragile trust placed upon him. He waited a few seconds, listening to the whispers of wind and trees. "See!" he commanded as he spun around with his arrows. Now, being able to understand Elvish, Aragorn spun at the same time he did with his sword. Gimli, however, wasn't too far behind them and was the first to throw his weapon at the bright light, suddenly shinning. The white wizard blocked the attacks with his staff and casted a heating spell of some sort on Aragorn's sword. The man was forced to drop it on the ground. The light blinded them from seeing the wizard's face, and Legolas was forced to look away. "You are tracking the trail of 2 young hobbits," the wizard said. "Where are they?" Aragorn asked. "They passed this way the day before yesterday," the wizard said. Legolas blinked in surprise. Had he really slept that long? He knew he was tired and needed rest, but he didn't mean to sleep a whole day away. He must have been more exhausted then, he thought. He silently thanked the trees for guarding over his sleep. They must have noticed how much he needed it. They met someone they did not expect. The wizard continued to say, "Does that comfort you?" Aragorn lowered the hand, blocking the light from his eyes, and took a step forward. "Who are you? Show yourself!" The light slowly faded until they were able to see the face of the white-haired wizard. Legolas was not surprised he did not recognize the wizard. However, his companions seemed to know him. They gasped in surprise. "It cannot be," Aragorn whispered in disbelief. Gimli bowed in respect to the wizard, but Aragorn still looked on with wonder. Legolas stood to the side, unsure if he should bow as well. "You fell," Aragorn whispered, "through fire and water. From the lowest dungeon to the highest peak I fought with the Balrog of Morgoth, until at last I threw down my enemy and smote his ruin upon the mountainside. Darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time. The stars wheeled overhead, and every day was as long as a life age of the earth, but it was not the end. I felt life in me again. I've been sent back until my task is done." Aragorn took a step forward until he was standing right in front of the wizard. "Gandalf," he muttered with relief. Legolas blinked in surprise. He had, of course, heard of Gandalf the Grey and his demise when he was passing the trees of Lorien. He had heard the somber singing of the elves and felt the pain of the trees at the wizard's passing. He was called Mithrandir to the elves, a wise and strong Istari. He grinned with amusement as he thought back to Treebeard's words. He did tell him the wizard was no longer gray, and that he had returned. Never meeting Gandalf, his thoughts did not stray to him first. He leaned forward on his bow, wondering if he should stay or go. His job was done. He led Aragorn and Gimli to the White Wizard to find their hobbit friends. However, it was rude to leave without saying goodbye. "Gandalf?" "Yes," Gandalf said distantly. "That is what they used to call me. Gandalf the Grey. That was my name." Gimli moved to stand next to Aragorn and grinned. "Gandalf," he murmured. Gandalf leaned forward. "I am Gandalf the White, and I come back to you now, at the turn of the tide." He pulled out a gray cloak from seemingly nowhere and put it on, hiding his white robes. "The turn of the tide?" Gimli asked, his eyes blinking in confusion. Gandalf nodded. "Yes. Speaking of such, come, we have much to do," he said as he started to lead them away. Legolas stepped forward toward Aragorn. "Now, Marie." He grasped Aragorn's forearm, and Aragorn returned his gesture. "Farewell, Diolaye," Aragorn said. "Thank you." Legolas nodded his head. "Tane Sisamin," "It was my pleasure. What is this?" Gandalf walked back to them and stood before them, leaning against his staff as he gazed at their linked arms and to Legolas. "Farewells. This is Legolas, Gandalf. He helped us in these woods," Aragorn introduced. Gandalf gave Legolas a searching, knowing look that made the elf uncomfortable, like he knew something. "We are heading in different direction," Gandalf scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous." He straightened up and turned away. "He's coming with us," he added as he started walking away again. Legolas blinked. "He was?" He turned to Aragorn in confusion, but the man couldn't give him an explanation. Gimli made a huff sound as he turned to follow the wizard, not looking too pleased to have Legolas join their company. "I am," he finally voiced his shock. "Come, Master Legolas. Come," Gandalf called out, "unless you don't wish to find out who you are." Aragorn glanced at Legolas, but the elf ignored his questioning look as he raced ahead to walk next to the wizard. "You know who I am, Master Gandalf?" he asked. Gandalf stopped walking, causing the rest of them to stop. He stared at Legolas for a look, while with Aragorn and Gimli looking on curiously. "You are at a crossroad, Legolas. If you decide to walk the path we do, you will find where you're from. If you decide to take a different road, you may never find the answers you seek. It is your decision, but you must decide now," he said, conveniently not answering Legolas's question. Gandalf shook his head. "We do not have all day." Indecisively, Legolas glanced at the waiting man and dwarf before turning back to Gandalf. Finding out where he came from was his deepest wish. He wanted to know if he had family out there, waiting for him, searching for him. He wanted to know what it is like to love, but he didn't know what challenges there would be on this road. What would they find in Edoras? The white wizard smiled. "Walk with us. You must have an answer by the time we leave the forest. Come." He started walking again, and the three followed obediently. Only one stage of the journey is over. Another is about to begin. War has come to Rohan. We must make to Edoras with great haste. Aragorn jogged forward to walk beside Gandalf. Legolas allowed them to pass him so he could walk in the rear, unsure of his position amongst the group. "We hear of trouble in Rohan. It goes ill with the king." Gandalf paused for a second and nodded. "Yes, that will not be easily cured." "Then we have run all this way for nothing." Gimli started to complain. "Are we to leave those poor hobbits in this horrid, dark, dank tree-infested?" The trees suddenly rumbled and creaked angrily. "The trees have feelings, Master Gimli," Legolas spoke softly. "The elves started it many, many years ago. They woke the trees and taught them to speak. You seemed to have insulted them," he informed, having had gotten the information from Treebeard the last time he was in the forest. Gimli stared at the groaning trees with wide, frightened eyes. "Talking trees? I meant to say charming. Quite charming forest. Charming." Gandalf stopped and turned to Gimli, speaking directly to the dwarf. It was more than mere chance that brought Merry and Pippin to Fangorn. A great power has been sleeping here for many long years. The coming of Merry and Pippin will be like the falling of small stones that starts an avalanche in the mountains, he stated. "In one thing you have not changed, dear friend," Aragorn said. Gandalf paused and turned to him. He questioned. "You still speak in riddles," the man answered. The two chuckled. Legolas watched the dynamic of the group. He noticed they were quite close and wondered where he could fit into that. He didn't want to disturb what they seemed to already have. Would he feel like an outsider? The one not understanding their inside jokes, like the riddle comment. A thing is about to happen here that has not happened since the Elder Days. Gandalf continued. The Ents are going to wake up and find that they are strong. He turned back around and started walking again. The Ents would awaken? Legolas would have loved to be here to see that happen. To witness such beauty of the Ents finding themselves strong would be a memory one could never forget. It spoke to the elf in Legolas. Treebeard had been the only Ent he had ever seen and spoke to. He was one of the oldest of his kind and had placed himself as watchkeeper over his slumbering brethren. Gimli paused, forcing Legolas to stop before he ran into him. "Strong? Oh, that's good," the dwarf said, glancing about the trees. He started walking again, with a nervous step, Legolas noticed. "So stop your fretting, Master Dwarf. Merry and Pippin are quite safe. In fact, they are far safer than you are about to be." Gimli stepped beside Legolas. "Let me tell you something, Master Elf. This new Gandalf's more grumpy than the old one." Legolas' lips twitched, amused at Gimli's complaints. They finally reached the edge of the forest and stepped into the bright sunlit day. There was a horse waiting for them that Aragorn quickly grabbed hold of and petted his nose. "Good, Hasufel," the man whispered to the horse. "Good boy." Legolas stood slightly away from the group, still unsure if he wanted to continue with them or find his own way. He hadn't traveled with a group in several hundred years. He wasn't sure if he knew how to do it anymore. A piercing whistle broke through his thoughts, and he turned his attention back Gandalf. He was facing away from them as he whistled again. An answering neigh was heard, and Legolas took a step forward when he saw a white horse appear from the plain. It was a beautiful horse, strong and pure. He came upon them swiftly, one of the Mieras. Legolas spoke with wonder. Unless his eyes were cheated by some spell, he was looking upon the fastest breed of horses in all of Middle-earth, the most intelligent and strongest horses known. It was a horse of kings, descendants from Felarof, the horse tamed by the first king of Rohan. The horse stopped in front of Gandalf, and the wizard petted it respectfully. "Shadowfax. He's the lord of all horses, and has been my friend through many dangers." He turned to Legolas. "Have you decided your path, Legolas?" he asked. Legolas felt trapped under the stares of the three people before him. He stared past them at Shadowfax. The white horse seemed to be staring at him as well. His eyes were showing wisdom and intelligence not commonly seen in animals. The wind brushed past him, and he turned his attention to the forest they had just left. If he returned back to the trees, what would his life be like? He would be doing the same thing he had been doing for almost 2,000 years. Hiding, avoiding, looking, and searching. He would be alone. He was an elf. Elves were not usually solitary creatures. He glanced at Aragorn, Gimli, and Gandalf. He couldn't say he never had a friend before, but he had outlived all those he befriended. It got to the point when he stopped trying, and that led him to a lonely life. "I have no horse," he said, as if looking for an excuse not to join. Gandalf chuckled. That could easily be changed. He let out another piercing whistle, and another horse appeared from the opposite direction. It was another white horse, but not one of the Miras. His coat wasn't as white as Shadowfax, nor was he as quick. There was gray in his coloring and his hair. He was bared back, no saddle or bridle, just the way Legolas liked riding. He liked feeling of the working muscles of the horse move between the legs. It made him feel like a part of the horse. "Arad," Aragorn said softly in recognition. Legolas stared at the horse before turning back to Gandalf. The wizard lifted up a brow in question. Adventure. He had been on an adventure his whole life. But this was different. This was a different adventure. This was no longer a war of men, but a war of Middle-earth. He could no longer ignore it. On this adventure, the White Wizard told him he would find his answers. They would be the answers he had been asking himself for almost 2,000 years. He tightened his jaw in determination and nodded. "I shall join you," he said with conviction. Chapter 3. King Thranduil stared at the wooden door before him, with his hands behind his back. He didn't know how long he had been standing there. He almost feared entering the bedchambers. He hadn't entered that room since they stopped the official searches for his son. He would oftentimes stand in front of the door, like he was doing now, wishing the door would open from the other side, and his bright-eyed Greenleaf would appear with a large, gleeful smile upon his face. He would jump into his arms while calling out his name, excited to tell him of some dream he had the night before. He sighed. That would never be. Even if they found his son, Legolas would be much too old to jump in his arms and tell him about his dreams of the whispering trees and kind animals. He would be grown up. Would he still be that happy child he was before his mother's death, or would be hardened by his time amongst the men of Middle-earth? He reached out and laid his hand on the door, remembering the event that followed Erenion's startling announcement. "It's your son. No one has been able to locate him for the past few hours. He's missing." Thranduil rushed out of his study and raced down the corridor to where Legolas's bedchamber was located. He heard the captain's swift feet following him, but paid him no mind. He didn't hesitate when he reached the familiar wooden door to his son's room. He wrenched it, opened it, calling out, "Legolas!" The room was empty. Legolas! His heart was hammering in his chest as it tried to release itself from the fear that clinched it. The bed was made. The curtains fluttered from the outside breeze. Birds whistled to one another in the early morning Sunday. Everything looked fine. Nothing seemed out of place. Looked, but it didn't feel fine. There was something in the air, an emptiness. It was hollow, like the atmosphere knew its occupant had left for good. Thranduil rushed to the wardrobe and flung the doors open. His heart skipped a beat. Some of his clothes were missing and his traveling bag. Thranduil looked over to the chair by Legolas's bed, where he knew his son kept his daggers. It was empty. He had left voluntarily. He was gone. He left. He left home. He left his father. He shook his head in disbelief. No, Ion Nin! My son. It was his fault. It was all his fault. He chased his son away with his words. First his wife, and now his son. He couldn't lose his son. He couldn't lose him like he lost his wife. Legolas was his world, his purpose of living. It felt like his heart was torn from his chest. It ached so much. He turned to Erenion, who stood in the doorway of the bedchamber with a grim expression. "Find my son, Captain," he ordered harshly, his pain reflecting in his eyes. Erenion nodded. "I've already sent a number of the guard into the forest in search of the prince, Hervoin." My Lord Thranduil didn't remember much after that. Everything gone by in a fog for the next year or so. It was a painful time. He remembered being in the infirmary. He could recall the pain in his heart, a numbness of his body, a chillness overcoming him, a shadow in his vision. The first thing he remembered with clarity after that was Erenion telling him Legolas had been spotted with men, traveling near the ruins of the lost kingdom of Eregion. He had felt hope flare in his heart, and determination made his muscles strong again. His son was still alive, but he was gone by the time elves reached the ruins. He shook his head away from that memory. "Aran Nin," Captain Erenion called out to him. "My king." Thranduil turned. "Yes, Captain?" He didn't ask how Erenion knew where to find him. He had been found several times standing in front of his son's bedchambers. Erenion glanced briefly at the closed door with a sad gleam in his eye before speaking. "I have a possible alarming report." Thranduil nodded. "Walk with me, Captain. Let's not speak of such matters here," meaning in front of his son's rooms where matters of affairs should not be discussed freely, as if an innocent elfling would eavesdrop. The place felt too sacred to speak of business affairs. "What is your concern?" he asked. "As you are aware, sire, the activity in the forest had grown significantly in the past few years. The number of orcs, spiders, and other foul beasts invest our wood more and more. Lately, however, the number of orcs is decreasing. Attacks and sightings have become rare in the past month." Thranduil stopped walking and faced him. "And this causes you concern?" Arenion nodded. "It is not in the nature of the orcs to back down. There is no reason for them to leave the woods. Not unless something is brewing in another part of Middle-earth." The Mirkwood king interrupted thoughtfully. "How certain are you that they are leaving the forest and not just going underground to await for us to slacken our defenses?" "What of Dol Guldur?" he asked. "Certain, your highness," the captain answered with confidence. "There have been sightings of large numbers of orcs heading towards the Brown Lands. Our spies told of a number of orcs still in Dol Guldur, but they haven't been leaving to attack any of our patrols." Thranduil glanced to the side and thought. Beyond the Brown Lands is part of Rohan, and beyond that, Mordor. "Something stirs in Rohan," he concluded. "Let us hope their hearts are strong and full of courage for what is to come." Arenion nodded. "There have been rumors of a dark illness over the land and its king." Thranduil nodded. "I have heard of such rumors. It is worrisome. Does this mean Gondor has lost Osgiliath and, possibly, Minas Tirith?" Arenion asked. "Has Gondor fallen?" Thranduil paused in thought, realizing his captain made an excellent point. If such a darkness entered Rohan, the army may be coming from Mordor. Gondor, last he knew, was doing its noble duty of holding the army of Mordor back from entering into Middle-earth. The city, Osgiliath, was what stood between the Black Gates and the rest of Middle-earth. It had a strategic importance as a crossing point over the Anduin. If Osgiliath had fallen, no, Gondor couldn't have fallen. If Gondor has fallen, we would have known it by now. The dark armies of Mordor would be flooding into Middle-earth without pause, without stealth, like a plague over this land. The orcs that infested our forest would be gaining in numbers, not leaving. Their attacks against us would be stronger and quicker. He pointed out to his captain. "No, this is something else. Something else must be happening. I need a map." He started walking again, heading towards his study. His captain followed behind him. They didn't speak until they were in the study. Thranduil pulled down his map from the wall and laid it flat on the desk. He and Arenion leaned over it, studying its contents. "Where could they possibly be going?" Thranduil murmured thoughtfully. Arenion used his finger to show a path from Mirkwood Forest, the Brown Lands, to Minas Tirith as he spoke. "Perhaps they are sneaking up from behind, attacking when the Gondor's army is occupied from attacks at front with the aid of Isengard, or they are going to attack Rohan." Thranduil shook his head. "I don't believe we would be able to find the answer without more information." He sighed and leaned back. "There is nothing we can do. Let's just hope our momentary freedom from constant attacks doesn't mean death and destruction for another." He gazed off again. Just like every time he heard of war brewing between Gondor and Rohan, or a civil war within a kingdom, his thoughts would stray to his son, fearful he would be swiped away in some battle. This time was no different. He hoped desperately Legolas was nowhere near Rohan or Gondor. Legolas gazed across the dark plains towards the direction of Edoras, capital city of Rohan. They were a day away from the city now. With his elfish eyes, he could see some light from candles, lighting the houses of those who were still up at this time. His mind was occupied by thoughts of who he could be. What members of his family remained in Middle-earth? Why was he not with them? What caused him to wander Middle-earth for so long? Long enough that his memory of them was gone. Why was he so young? He couldn't even remember if he left them willingly or not. Legolas. The elf turned and saw Aragorn coming up from behind him. He hadn't talked much to the man since he agreed to come along on their journey 4 days ago. Actually, he hadn't much talked to anyone. There hadn't been much chance to talk, and he didn't know what to say to them. He felt very much like an outsider. They knew each other well, and he was new to their group. He didn't know them, and they didn't know him. He had felt Aragorn's eye on him several times, and Legolas couldn't tell if the gaze was one of mistrust or a look of consideration. His face had remained passive, expressionless. A habit, he was sure, that the man had picked up from living among elves. He gave a polite nod of recognition to the man and turned back to the tiny lights of Edoras. "Aragorn," he greeted softly. The man stood beside him, and Legolas spared him a quick glance. "Is it your turn to keep watch?" "Nay, Melanin." Legolas glanced curiously at him. They hadn't known each other for long, and barely spoke during the time they have known each other. With his mind believing Aragorn distrust him, he didn't expect to be called his friend so quickly. Did he truly see him as a friend? "I just wished to see how you were doing. Following us would not be easy. It is going to be a rough journey. I cannot foresee our final destination. You truly have no knowledge of whence you came?" Legolas nodded. "I can remember a vast, dark forest, emotions, and blurry faces and objects, but nothing helpful. If it is helpful, I believe you might be from the Greenwood realm." Aragorn gave willingly. Legolas gave him a hopeful look. "What makes you think so?" "Your arrows," the man answered, nodding his head towards the quiver of arrows on the elf's back. Legolas reached behind him and pulled one out. "It is of Mirkwood design, different feathers and wood, but you have the leaf marking at the end," he said, pointing to the leaf carving near the feathers. "The mark of Mirkwood. Your arrows are not painted. Rivendell and Lorien elves paint their arrows." Legolas studied the leaf he had carved. He never had any idea what the leaf meant, only knew it was from his home. To keep a part of his unknown home with him, he had made sure all his arrows had that mark. "I copied my arrows according to an arrow I had with me when the nomad tribe of men found me." He still had that arrow. It had become a sacred thing to him. He had it hidden in a secret pouch in his quiver. "Mirkwood," he murmured as he stared at the arrow in his hand. He finally had a clue, a destination. The clue had been in front of him the entire time, and he had been blinded with his lack of knowledge. He felt a strong urge to go to Mirkwood, but he couldn't. He had given his word he would go to Edoras with this group. Maybe there was more he needed to learn of who he was before making his way to the Greenwood realm. He replaced his arrow into the quiver and glanced across the plain. "What you do believe we will find Edoras?" he asked. Aragorn glanced in the direction of Edoras as well. "I'm not sure, but certainly not joyful faces. I sense they will not welcome us easily." Legolas turned to him. "How did you become part of this quest? What quest exactly are you on? I cannot seem to understand how a man, a dwarf, a wizard, and 2 hobbits came together. It makes no sense to me, especially the hobbits. That bewilders me." Aragorn hesitated. Catching his hesitation, Legolas turned away. "I don't usually pry into another's business, but I am now a part of this quest of yours." He turned back to face the man. "I would like to know what this is all about. The purpose of our quest has changed. There were 2 other hobbits you haven't met. They are carrying on the original quest alone. Our purpose now is to thwart Sauron's control over these lands." Legolas wanted to ask about the original quest, but felt Aragorn would not be so forthcoming with that information. He nodded in acceptance and changed the subject once again. He gave Aragorn a quick look. "You bear a great burden on your shoulders," he noticed. It was in the man's eyes and the way he carried himself. Legolas could see the weight the man carried. Aragorn snapped his head towards him, the only indication he was surprised. He looked away and nodded. "Yes, there's a decision I must make that I do not wish to make." He stared at him. "I also have no wish to speak of it, Legolas," he said with a sharp tone. The man winced at his own tone. "I apologize. It is a sensitive subject for me, especially now that my destiny is creeping up ever closer. It's been growing heavily in my mind." Legolas didn't know what to say or do to give comfort to him. He turned away, gazing at the vast sky above them, dark with an array of bright stars. "You wish not to be who you are, and I wish to find who I am," he muttered. He gave Aragorn a slight grin. "What a pair we make, Aragorn, son of Arathorn." Aragorn returned the grin, catching on to the irony. "You should get some sleep. It is my turn to keep watch." Legolas wished him a good night and headed to his sleep roll. Legolas rode Arod into the gated city of Edoras behind Shadowfax and Gandalf. Aragorn and Gimli rode Hasufel behind him. He frowned at his first glance of the city in this century. It was different than what he remembered. A lot different. The darkness that had spread across Rohan took its toll on the usually cheerful people of the city. The city once welcomed outsiders, but now seemed to be scared of them. The mothers pulled their children to them, hiding them behind their skirts or pushing them into their houses. They stared at them fearfully. There was not a single smile in the place. Everyone walked with their heads down, trying not to draw attention to themselves. They gave them a wide berth, as if they didn't want to be around outsiders. It was quiet, too quiet. Legolas quickly pulled his hood over his head to prevent more stares. "You would find more cheer in a graveyard," he heard Gimli muttered quietly from somewhere behind him, where he rode with Aragorn. Legolas nodded along with his comment, agreeing with the dwarf. They made their way up to King Théoden's home, the Golden Hall of Meduseld. The Rohirrim guards greeted them near the hall's stable and had the stable boys take their horses. Legolas patted Arod reassuringly on the head before a young boy took the white horse into the stable. He hoped Gandalf knew what he was doing, he thought, as he glanced at the cold and dull expressions on the guards' faces. They were men that had seen much in their short years, but it had only made them stronger. A few guards led them up the steps to the Golden Hall until they stood before the door. A large man with reddish-brown, shoulder-length hair and a short beard met them there, surrounded by his guards in heavy armor. His blue eyes stared at the four of them. Legolas caught the way his eyes narrowed in confusion as he stared at the odd group. He turned to Gandalf. "I cannot allow you before the king so armed, by order of—" He paused briefly. "Grima Wormtongue," he said in a forced, dignified manner, but the way his face pulled back revealed his disgust. "Hand over your weapons," he ordered. A few of the guards stepped forward, ready to take their weapons. Legolas swung his quiver off his back, but hesitated to give it to the guard before him. His treasured arrow was hidden in the quiver. What if something happened? What if they don't return it to him? At the corner of his eye, he could see Aragorn handing another guard his sword before pulling out a few pairs of daggers. He sighed in resignation as he handed his quiver of arrows to the guard. It would not help matters if he refused. He gave him his bow next, before touching his daggers fondly. They were another treasured item, the other thing he had with him for as long as he could remember. They too bared the leaf that Aragorn said was the mark of Mirkwood. Reluctantly, he gave his daggers to the guard. He glared at him, silently warning him to hand them back over when they were done here. He pulled out 3 other pairs of daggers from his back, his boots, and his sleeves. However, he was not one to go unarmed. He made sure to keep a small dagger hidden in his tunic. "Your staff," the leader of the guard said to Gandalf. Gandalf leaned against it. "Oh, you wouldn't take away an old man's walking stick, would you?" The man hesitated, giving Gandalf a knowing looking, and allowed them entrance into the hall. Gandalf turned to Legolas. "Legolas, will you help me into the hall? It seems my legs were weakened by the stairs," he asked, keeping up the pretense he was just a weak old man in need of help. Legolas nodded, surprised the wizard had asked him. "Of course," he said, as he took Gandalf by the arms. He helped Gandalf into the hall. It was only then did he let go of his arms, but Legolas made sure he stayed at his side. He eyed the sickly king sitting on the throne. Was he supposed to be that old? Legolas had thought he was only in his 40s. He knew men did not look like that when they were only 40. King Theoden was extremely white. His wrinkled face, his long hair, even his eyes were white. He supported a long white beard and shoulder-length hair. Both were wispy and messy. His body looked weak, sitting there, hunched over like he was. Next to him was a character that was almost polar opposite than him. He was a dark figure, black clothing, black long hair, and physically smaller than any Legolas had seen in Rohan. The only thing he had in common with the king was the extremely pale skin. He looked to be an oily man, a minion for some darker master. Legolas took an instant disliking for him. He must be the man the guard had shown disgust at, Grima Wormtongue. Gandalf took a step forward. "The courtesy of your hall is somewhat lessened of late, Theoden King," he said, speaking of the darkness that Legolas was sure he could sense, and their rather solemn welcome. Legolas eyed the guards that stood around the room. More particularly, he eyed the group, dressed in black, that had followed them. Their eyes were dark with the lust of battle. Puppets of Saruman, he was sure. Those would be the ones to attack. He is not welcomed here. Legolas' sharp ears caught Grima whispering into the Ill King's ear. "Why should I welcome you, Gandalf Stormcrow?" His voice sounded weak and tired. The king looked towards Grima, as if asking if he said the right thing. Legolas's stomach coiled with disgust at a proud king, bowing to a man like Grima. "Careful, Legolas," Aragorn whispered from the other side of Gandalf. "Those men are about to pounce." Legolas nodded, letting the man know he was keeping an eye on them as well. "A just question, my liege," Grima said as he stood up, showing confidence he wouldn't have if he didn't have the power. "Late is the hour in which this conjurer chooses to appear." As he spoke, he walked closer to Gandalf. His words spoke of his lack of knowledge to Gandalf's fall months ago. "Lathspell, I name him. Ill news is an ill guest." He spoke directly into Gandalf's face. "Be silent. Keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. I have not passed through fire and death to bandy crooked words with a witless worm." Gandalf held out his staff in front of him. Grima immediately backed off. "His staff," he muttered as he backed away. "I told you to take the wizard's staff," he yelled out to his men. The men Legolas and Aragorn had been eyeing rushed forward. Legolas had no time to see where Aragorn or Gimli attacked first, as he rushed to meet up with a man heading straight for Gandalf. He punched the man in the stomach and elbowed his head before giving the fall man a kick in the face, quickly knocking him out. He turned just in time to see another man flying at him with his fist. He ducked quickly, and the man's fist flew over him. Legolas wrapped his arms around the man's midsection and flipped him over him. The man fell to the ground with a groan, the wind having been knocked out of him. Legolas quickly went to the last man standing. Aragorn and Legolas both gave the man a punch when the man tried to reach Gandalf, who was speaking to King Theoden. "Too long have you sat in the shadows," the wizard was saying. The man stumbled, but didn't fall. He turned to them and sneered. Aragorn moved to punch the man in the face, but the man leaned back, dodging the fist. Legolas saw the perfect opportunity to knock him down while he was leaning back. With the quickness and gracefulness of being an elf, Legolas got to the ground and stuck out his leg, tripping the man. The man's balance disturbed. He fell, back first, onto the ground. Legolas quickly straddled him and punched him unconscious. He stood up and glanced around, looking for any other men to fit. Most of the guards were still off to the side. None came forward. Aragorn was eyeing the room as well, waiting for another to attack. Gimli stood over Grima with his foot on his chest. Legolas touched his tunic where his dagger was hidden, glad he didn't see it as necessary to pull it out. Legolas turned his attention back to Gandalf. He was now standing right in front of the throne chair. "Hearken to me. I release you," he said as he held his hand up. From the spell, nothing happened. Theoden started laughing. Legolas narrowed his eyes. His laughter had strength his words did not have before. "You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey," he said, his voice stronger and different. It was not Theoden that was speaking. There was a stench in the air of evil magic being done. There was only one evil magical user he knew of that it could possibly be. Saruman. Legolas whispered to himself. Gandalf threw aside his gray robes, revealing the white clothes he had hidden underneath. Legolas felt the power of Gandalf, the white wash over him like water. He welcomed the power as Theoden leaned back in his chair, cringing at the blinding white of Gandalf. "I will draw you, Saruman, as poison is drawn from a wound." He pointed his staff at him, and Theoden squirmed in his seat, as if struggling to escape bondage. "Ah," Theoden groaned. Legolas heard the rush of light feet making their way to the front, and he quickly turned to stop the person before they interrupt. But Aragorn got there before him. He pulled a lady in white to his side and whispered into her ear. "Wait!" Legolas turned back to the front. Theoden leaned forward as far as he could. "If I go, Theoden dies," Saruman said through the king's body. Gandalf pointed his staff at the king, and Theoden flew back against his throne. "You did not kill me." "You will not kill him," he stated firmly. Theoden struggled to lean forward again. "Rohan is mine," he shouted before jumping at Gandalf. Legolas tensed up, ready to move forward to protect Gandalf. But the wizard held his staff up and made a jabbing motion, like stabbing someone with a sword. "Begone!" he shouted. Theoden flew backwards against the throne chair. Theoden groaned and started to fall forward. The lady in white shoved Aragorn away and rushed towards him. She caught him before he fell. Legolas watched with amazement as he began to de-age. Color returned his skin. His hair grew shorter and became blonde. The winkles disappeared to just a few. He looked to be a strong man of 40 once again. He glanced up at the lady who knelt before him. He reached out with his hand and lightly touched her cheek. "I know your face," he whispered. "Éowyn." A smile grew. "Éowyn," he said, with pleased recognition. He looked around and saw Gandalf. His face narrowed with confusion. "Gandalf?" he questioned. like he was unsure what he saw was real. Gandalf nodded. "Breathe the free air again, my friend." The king turned away. "Dark have been my dreams of late," he said, remembering. He stood up. The lady, Eowyn, helped him. He glanced at his body and pulled his hands to his face. He stared at them as he slowly clinched them together. "Your fingers would remember their old strength better if they grasped your sword," Gandalf said, turning to the guard that had spoke to them outside. The man stepped forward and held out a sword. Theoden drew it out of the sheath and held it in front of him. He examined it carefully, as if looking for wounds on a loved one. Legolas heard a shuffle, and everyone turned to Grima, who was still being held down by Gimli. Theoden's stare was cold and unforgiving when he looked upon the snake. Grima shivered with fear, perhaps sensing what Legolas sensed. The King of Rohan would be harsh to the shivering worm. Chapter 4. Legolas couldn't help but pity the pathetic creature. It must have been the elf in him that could feel any pity for him, for he did not deserve pity for what he had done. He watched calmly as Theoden King dragged Grima Wormtongue out of the hall. The crowd followed the king and stood by to watch as he threw Grima through the doors and out in the sun for all of Edoras to see his disgrace. Legolas didn't move from his spot inside the hall, debating if he should watch, but Aragorn, Gandalf, and Gimli all followed the king. He should too. He sighed as he headed out. He stood in the back as he watched Theoden's wrath, leaning against the doorframe with calm disinterest. Had me crawling on all fours like a beast. The Rohan king was shouting as he held his sword out towards Grima. The people of Edoras formed a crowd at the base of the hall, curious as to what was going on. Most were glad to see their king return, and Grima disgraced. Grima crawled backwards, away from Theoden. He raised his arms defensively. "Send me not from your side," he argued desperately, but Theoden was beyond listening to him. He rose up his sword to strike Grima down, but Aragorn rushed forward and laid his hand on Theoden's arm. "No, my lord. Number let him go," Aragorn said. Theoden turned to him as if surprised. Enough blood has been spilt on his account. Theoden stepped back almost wearily and nodded in agreement. Aragorn turned to Grima and held out his hand to him as a peace offering. Grima sneered and spat in his hand before running off, yelling at the crowd, "Get out of my way." Legolas instinctively mapped out the wind and the distance between him and Grima. If he had his arrows, and if Aragorn wasn't right about the blood split on his account, he could easily have shot him. The wind wasn't strong, and Grima wasn't too far for his arrows. "Hail, Theoden King!" Aragorn shouted to the crowd before kneeling before the King of Rohan. Legolas nodded his head forward in respect as the crowd knelt before their newly reinstated king. But Theoden didn't seem to be paying attention to his kneeling subjects. He looked around absent-mindedly before his eyes narrowed in concern. "Where is Theodred? Where is my son?" Eowyn gasped and stepped down to her uncle. She laid a comforting arm around him and turned to a nearby servant. "Randusa, could you show our guest to rooms to rest? I will take care of my uncle." The servant girl bowed as Eowyn turned to her uncle. "Uncle, there is something I must show you," she said softly, her voice full of grief. Randusa, the servant girl, bowed before Aragorn and Gandalf. "Come, my lords, I shall show you to our guest rooms." She led them back inside. The funeral of Theodred was short and sad. Legolas felt like he was intruding. He did not know the deceased. He did not know those close to the deceased. It was awkward and strange. He stood there stiffly beside Aragorn and Gimli, not knowing what he should do. He was an immortal living among the mortal. He had seen much death in his 2,000 years. He had become numb to it. It aged him faster than that of men. Death was something he knew far too well for an elf his age. He had learned quickly that he was more affected by death than mortals. He had to train himself to become numb to it, making it look to others that he was cold, uncaring when it came to death. He sighed as he set his sword down on the bed, where his other weapons were laid out. He looked around the small, simple room given to him by the servant girl. It a spacious room, but Legolas cared not. All he needed was the bed, and at least one opened window. The fact the room also had nice furnishings wasn't important to him. The rug was soft and comfortable. The wood of the wardrobe was carved with great talent. The fireplace mantel was delicately painted with browns and reds, and the bathing area was in a corner with a screen for privacy. Simple, but nice. He sat down on the mattress and pulled his quiver to him. He started going through his arrows, counting them and checking for any damage. He sighed. None were damaged, but he would need to make more arrows soon. He gathered up his weapons again and placed them back on his person. As soon as he was finished, there was a knock on the door. He went to the door and opened it. Gimli was standing there. "We're needed in the throne room." Legolas nodded and stepped out of his room, closing the door behind him. "You know why?" he asked. They started walking as Gimli answered. Two children came with word of wild men burning villages. He shrugged his shoulders. "I know nothing else, but there will be food." Legolas shook his head with amusement of the dwarf's endless stomach. They walked the rest of the way in silence. When they got to the room, Gimli immediately gathered a plate for himself and sat down at side table, while Legolas paused in the doorway to survey the room. Two children, a boy and a girl, were eating soup. The king's sister's daughter was sitting with them. Aragorn was smoking a pipe in a corner close to where Gimli was, now tearing into his food. Gandalf was sitting on the chair at the right hand of the throne, the advisor's chair. King Theoden had just stood up and took a few steps away from Gandalf. The room was tense. "Éomer cannot help us," the king was saying. He paused and turned back to Gandalf. "I know what is that you want of me, but I would not bring further death to my people. I will not risk open war. Open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not," Aragorn said from his little corner. Theoden turned to the ranger and walked over. His eyes were narrowed. "When last I looked, Theoden, not Aragorn, was the king of Rohan," he said. Legolas cocked his head to the side. Theoden had stressed the word Rohan just a little, as if bringing the point that they were in Rohan and not some other kingdom. But why? He shook the thought away for now. There was a moment of silence as Legolas tried to decipher what he had missed. Gimli said the two children warned them about wild men burning villages. Now, they were talking about war. The wild men must be agents of Saruman. Gandalf and Aragorn believed Theoden should fight, but the king didn't want more death come to his people. Legolas understood both sides of the argument. The final decision would weigh heavily on any king's mind, whether or not he made the right choice. It made Legolas glad he was not the ruler of any people. He didn't know how he could take such decision without wondering, forever, if it was the right one. Gandalf finally broke the silence. "Then what is the king's decision?" Another moment of silence before Theoden answered. "We shall make to Helm's Deep," he announced. He turned and called out, "Hama." The guard that had led them into the hall the day before came out from where he was waiting in the shadows. "Walk with me," Theoden ordered. "I have a message for Edoras. I need you to deliver." They left the room without a backward glance, brushing past Legolas in the doorway. Legolas waited until they had completely passed him before walking farther into the room. Gandalf had stood up and was staring after the king's retreating form with disappointment. "Come, children, let's get you cleaned up now." Éowyn spoke to the two children as she led them out of the room gently. Aragorn stood up and stood next to Gandalf. He shook his head. "I do not like this," he whispered as Legolas reached them. "Going to Helm's Deep will not stop Saruman from striking at them. They are a target there. They are going to need help," Legolas added quietly. He looked down at Gimli when the dwarf forwent his food and finally joined them. "He will not fight alone," Gandalf said. "I must make haste if I am to reach Éomer in time. Wait for me here while I gather my things." He left them to gather his supplies from the guest room before they could ask him another farther questions. Legolas blinked as he stared at Aragorn's resigned face to Gimli's head nodding in agreement. He turned and quickly followed Gandalf. "Legolas!" Aragorn called out, but the elf didn't stop. He found Gandalf where he knew the wizard would be, the guest room. "You're leaving by yourself?" he asked, already knowing the answer. He stood in the doorway, watching the wizard pack a small bag of provisions. "You are needed with the people of Rohan, Legolas." The white wizard turned to face him, ready to leave. "You have given me your word that this journey would help me discover where I come from. I haven't. You will find the answers you seek, Legolas." Gandalf interrupted. "The journey is not yet finished. This is just the beginning. Come," he ordered as they stepped out of the room. They walked quickly down the corridor. "You have already discovered something of your background, have you not?" he asked as they headed back to the throne room. Legolas nodded. "Aragorn made his belief known to me that I may be from Mirkwood. You wish to travel there." It was statement, but Legolas found himself nodding. Gandalf stopped walking, forcing Legolas to stop as well. He turned to him. "You are needed here," he repeated. "Mirkwood could wait." Legolas shook his head. "I don't see how much help I could be. I am but one elf. If I leave to Mirkwood, it would not change anything here." Gandalf gave him a look that told Legolas he was wrong. "Stay, Legolas. Your presence will help in the end. It will help a great deal." Legolas gave him a look, trying to decipher the erudite look in the wizard's eye. "What knowledge are you keeping from me, Master Gandalf?" he questioned. "Your presence may affect the lives of many if you stay until the end, and you will discover what you wish to know. Patience is all you have to have. Patience, Legolas. Elves are known for their patience." Legolas sighed. "I lived among men my whole life, and men, they don't have patience. I have become extremely patient with them. I had no choice but to be. I shall reach for my patience once again, Mithrandir," he promised, using the elfish name for Gandalf. He may not have been around his own kind, but after 2,000 years, he was able to pick up on random information. He was glad he was able to use the knowledge. Gandalf nodded. "Good," he smiled. "That's good." He turned and walked away. Legolas stayed there, watching him leave. He sighed. He reached up, thoughtfully, and lightly touched the sensitive points of his ears. There was a slight tingle down his spine when his fingers brushed his ears. An elf, he reminded himself. He spent his whole life that he could remember with men. There were a few times he had not really forgotten, but put aside the fact he was an elf. There were rare times when he almost considered himself more man than elf. Why wouldn't he? Life among man was all he knew. He wouldn't be surprised if he was less patient then. A normal elf, less graceful, less elegant, less wise. He almost looked upon elves with the same awe as men. Almost he had never seen his kinfolk up close before, even when he had entered the woods around Rivendell. He had sensed them nearby, eyeing his back, but they remained in the trees, and he had always left before they could reveal themselves. Legolas shook his head and headed back to the throne room. By the time he got there, his 3 companions were gone. Knowing they were going to the stables, he left the hall. The town was in a rush. Women gathering supplies, the men helping, the children crying. Wagons and horses were in the road. Legolas barely gave the hustle and bustle a glance as he entered the stable. He stood next to Gimli as Gandalf prepared Shadowfax. His presence was barely noticed. Aragorn helped him as Gandalf spoke. No way out than that of ravine. Theoden is walking into a trap. He thinks he is leading them to safety, but what he'll get is a massacre. He sighed. Theoden has a strong hold, but I fear for him. I fear for the survival of Rohan. He will need you before the end, Aragorn. The people of Rohan will need you. The defenses have to hold. Legolas raised an eyebrow. That was nearly the same thing he had told Legolas just a moment ago, but he had sensed the truth both times. He wasn't lying when he said Legolas and Aragorn would be needed. He just didn't see why. He didn't understand. He was, as he said before, just one elf. They will hold, Aragorn said with confidence. Gandalf nodded at his confidence and turned to Shadowfax. He frowned as he petted his horse. The Grey Pilgrim, he mused. That is what they used to call me. 300 lives of men I've walked this earth, and now I have no time. He turned back to Aragorn. Good luck. My search will not be in vain. He jumped on Shadowfax's bareback. He stared down at Aragorn. Look to my coming, at first light, on the 5th day. At dawn, look to the east. Aragorn nodded. Go, he whispered. Gandalf turned to Gimli and Legolas by the stable's doors and gave them a goodbye nod, giving Legolas a meaningful look. The elf returned the nod with a silent promise to remain by Aragorn's side before Gandalf galloped out of the stables. Aragorn walked and stood by Legolas as they watched the wizard leave Edoras. They stood there for a second before Aragorn spoke. Come, let's give aid to those who may need it. He headed into the bustle of Edoras without waiting for a response. Legolas sat on the steps outside of the hall. His pack was next to him on the step. He carefully curved the piece of wood with his dagger. His eyes narrowed in concentration as he made the leaf near the feathers. He blew at the tiny particles of wood and rubbed the curved leaf with his thumb, the symbol of Mirkwood. He nodded in satisfaction and placed the arrow into his quiver. King Theoden had offered to give him some arrows, but Legolas preferred to make his own. It was a task he enjoyed immensely. He found it relaxing and gave him a connection to his arrows, a feeling of success. He sighed and leaned forward on his knees. He stared out at the scared townspeople. They were silent as they gathered near the Golden Hall, but the sound of the horses, the wagons, and other animals were loud. Even the children remained quiet and close to their mothers. It was almost unnerving. There you are. The elf turned and greeted Gimli with a nod. Aragorn was looking for you. It's about time to leave, the dwarf said, gruffly. Legolas nodded. Thank you, Gimli. I shall be there shortly. He turned back around and gathered his pack and weapons. Gimli headed back into the hall without him, not bothering to wait for him to gather everything. Legolas wasn't offended. He knew all about the animosity between elves and dwarves. He had the unfortunate encounter with a group of dwarves several years ago that taught him much about the bad blood between the two races. After meeting those dwarves, he was surprised just how well Gimli was responding to him. He wasn't nearly as bad as those other dwarves. Growing up away from the elves, Legolas didn't feel the same animosity. Legolas stood and entered the hall. Aragorn was fastening his belt around his waist, and Gimli stood next to him, waiting. They both looked up when Legolas came closer. "I am not Gandalf," Aragorn said to him. Legolas kept his face passive, but felt the confusion of his statement inside. "I will not demand you to stay by my side for a fight that is not yours. I can only ask." Legolas stared at the man before him in thought. He didn't bother to point out that Gandalf didn't necessarily demand him to stay, just highly suggested him to. He picked his words carefully. "You do not speak honestly, Aragorn." The man blinked in surprise. "This fight does not belong to Rohan alone. This is just a battle in a war for Middle-earth. It is my fight, just as it is yours and Gimli's. I shall stay by your side, as I had promised Gandalf." Aragorn tilted his head to him gratefully. "Gurin Glasu, my heart is glad," another way of saying thank you. They set off, not long afterwards. Legolas quickly went ahead, making full usage of his elven heritage to scout for danger. The first day went by quickly, but the days seemed to slow down as people became more restless and tired. Near the end of the third day, Aragorn joined Legolas on watch, while the people rested from a long day walk. Legolas watched him as he approached. He was wiping something off his hands with the edge of his cloak, with a disgusted look. The elf raised a curious brow when he noticed an apparent wet spot on his leggings. "Is something the matter?" he asked the man once he stood beside him. Aragorn glanced at him briefly before looking down at his leggings. "I spilt stew," he explained. "Stew?" Aragorn nodded. "Anything of interest?" he asked, getting off the topic of the spilt stew. Legolas gave him an amused glance before shaking his head. "It's quiet." He eyed the horizon uneasily. "Too quiet?" the man asked, catching his uneasy look. Legolas paused in thought before shaking his head. "I don't sense anything. It's only my experience that warns me it would not stay this way. It would be too tempting for Saruman not to attack." Aragorn nodded. "Yes, I agree." He glanced back at the people of Rohan, as if considering how tempting it would be for Saruman. He wouldn't pass this chance by. Legolas turned his gaze to the man beside him. He could see the physical resemblance between Arathorn and Aragorn more keenly with that expression on the man's face. He had seen Arathorn bore that same heavy look on his face. He turned away to face the horizon again. "I met him once," he said suddenly, switching to Elvish for the current topic of conversation. "You remind me of him. Of whom do you speak of?" Aragorn asked in Elvish. "Your father, Arathorn II," he answered as he glanced back at Aragorn. Only the slight widened of his eyes informed Legolas of the man's surprise. "We've met very briefly when our paths cross on our travels." "That is how you knew I was of the Dunedain," Legolas nodded. "It was almost 100 years ago that our paths crossed. We spoke not of personal issues. I did not speak of my lack of knowledge on myself, and he kept whatever secret he deemed too personal." Feeling the need to tell Aragorn something sentimental of his father, he said he was heading homeward towards his wife, who was with child. He was proud of his imminent fatherhood. That was all he spoke of, but I saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that he would not be worthy of such a gift, fear of what the future could be for his child. Aragorn took the information in, but didn't speak his thoughts. "He's a leader. I had sensed that from what he spoke of. You carried that same burden of leadership upon your shoulders. I noticed it the moment I saw you. My father joined our ancestors when I was but a child. I carry no memory of him," Aragorn corrected, catching Legolas's present tense. Legolas tilted his head down in respect. "I am sorry to hear that. He was an admirable man and friend." Aragorn nodded and turned his gaze to the horizon. "You were right, my friend. He was a leader of his people, the chieftain of the Dunedain." Legolas snapped his head to him in surprise. That was a title taken by the heirs of Isildur after the loss of the kingdom of Arthedain. His eyes widened with realization. "You are Isildur's heir and the heir to the throne of Gondor." Aragorn nodded solemnly. Legolas, still caught in his surprise, turned and nodded. "I can now understand your burden, for that is a heavy burden to carry indeed. I shall stay by your side, Aragorn," he promised once again. "If you have need of me, I shall be there." "Thank you, my friend," Aragorn said in the common tongue. Legolas tilted his head in acknowledgement of his gratitude and turned his gaze back to the setting sun along the horizon. Chapter 5. Legolas was once again standing ahead of the mass of Rohan people, scanning the surroundings with his sharp senses. Something was brewing in his mind, something dark and evil. He stood there, trying to catch what it was and where it would come from. He narrowed his eyes at the horizon as he tried to figure it out. The sound of horse hooves pulled his attention away from the horizon. He turned and saw the captain of the king's guard, Hama, and his second, Gamling, riding off between the hills. Legolas frowned and narrowed his eyes at his uneasy feeling. He closed his eyes and focused on his hearing. A deep growl coming from the direction Hama and Gamling went. He popped his eyes open and rushed forward, just as he could hear the sound of a scream, followed by the sound of steel against steel. He quickly jumped down to the path the two guards took and saw a lone orc riding a warg. He didn't hesitate to take an arrow from his quiver and shoot it into the warg's side. The orc fell off the dead warg and landed roughly on the ground. Legolas rushed at him, pulling out one of his daggers. The orc turned and let out a piercing scream just before Legolas cut his throat. He cursed to himself for not being fast enough. He heard Aragorn's light footsteps come up from behind him. Living among elves had taught Aragorn's feet to be swift and silent. It helped Legolas identify Aragorn just by his footsteps. "A scout!" he called back to him, answering his unasked question. He heard Aragorn rushed to tell Theoden. Legolas gave a passing glance to Hama's lifeless body before returning to the scout. He had let out a scream, and that would have alerted the others. He felt his body tense with realization what that meant. As if knowing what he had realized, he could suddenly feel the ground shake and hear the rushing of more warg heading towards them. He quickly rushed ahead and stood on a hill. His eyes narrowed when he saw the number of wargs rushing over the plain. He pulled out another arrow and took aim. He didn't hesitate to shoot at them as he waited for the Rohan warriors. He could feel the pounding of hooves coming from behind him and hear the neighing of horses and clinging of swords. Men rose their voices in a wild war cry as they rode their horses rapidly up the hill where Legolas stood. He glanced back quickly to find his horse and saw the bare-backed horse coming swiftly towards him. Arad didn't slow down to give Legolas time to jump on, but that didn't disturb the elf. As Arad came up beside him, Legolas quickly wrapped his arms around the neck of the horse and flipped onto his back. He did so without breaking his concentration. As soon as he was on the back of his horse, Legolas pulled out another arrow from his quiver and fired it at the incoming wargs. He rode with the Rohirrim riders as the two parties crashed at full speed and began the battle. The cries of battle echoed the hillside, the sound of metal against metal, of horses neighing, of growls, and the cries of the dying filled Legolas's ears. He could almost taste death upon his lips as men slaughter orc and orc slaughter men. His body was tense, and his blood rushed through his veins with awareness and disgust. Legolas shot an orc off his warg and glanced back just in time to see Gimli get fling off of Aragorn's horse. A cry of the riderless. Warg brought Legolas around. The warg was stalking towards Gimli, and he quickly shot it, feeling like warg was his responsibility, being the one that made it riderless. "Arr, that one was mine," he heard Gimli yell out to him. Legolas ignored him and returned to the battle at hand. To save on arrows, and because it was a close encounter battle, he pulled out his daggers and jumped off his horse. He swiftly cut the throat of an approaching orc. The battle didn't take long, only half an hour or so, before there were only a few stragglers. Legolas glanced around the field with his face set into indifference. There were so few left of the Rohirrim warriors. They walked amongst the bodies of the dead, looking for survivors. Riderless horses raced away from the scene. Some Rohirrim soldiers tried to catch some of them and calm them down. With his sharp eye, Legolas glanced at each face, tired, worn, and grief-stricken. The cost of battle. He walked towards Gimli, pausing when he caught sight of a familiar horse lying lifelessly on the ground. He knelt down and touched the neck. "Hasufel," he whispered in recognition. He glanced up and looked around for the rider. "Aragorn?" he called out. He stood and glanced around, looking more closely at the faces around him. "Aragorn," he called out again. Gimli glanced up at his call, his face looking alarmed. He glanced around as well, noticing his leader missing. "Aragorn," he called out as well. Legolas turned to glance around, looking for any sign of their leader. His eyes narrowed with worry when he couldn't spot him. "Tell me what happened and I will ease your passing," he heard Gimli growl. Legolas turned back to the dwarf and saw him leaning over a dying orc. The orc was cracking a pleased laugh. Curiously, he approached them in time to hear the orc's response. "He's a cough, dead." It laughed again, and Legolas clenched his teeth together in annoyance. He took a little tumble off the cliff. Legolas' eyes widened, and he glanced back at the edge of the cliff. In disbelief, as the orc took its last breath, he was lying. He had to be. "Legolas," Gimli whispered in horror. The elf glanced down and saw the dwarf taking something from the orc's hand. He held it up for Legolas to see. It was Aragorn's necklace, the white, shining Evenstar. Legolas reached out and gently took the necklace from Gimli. "This cannot be," he whispered. He quickly turned from the dead orc and stepped onto the cliff. Gimli followed him. He glanced down at the rushing waters below. It would have been a miracle if he had survived. He felt the Rohan king come up from behind. There was a brief moment of respectful silence before Theoden turned away and addressed Gamling. "Get the wounded on horses. The wolves of Isengard will return." He paused as if considering. "Leave the dead." Legolas snapped his head up. His mind was whirling with the idea of leaving Aragorn behind, body lifeless or not. Theoden glanced at him directly in the eye, as if to show him how firm he was in his decision. How sorry. "Come," he ordered, turning away. He started to walk away, but Legolas couldn't pull himself from the cliff. He turned back to the rushing waters. The river would have taken Aragorn far by now, but he still wanted to look. "I promised Aragorn and Gandalf I will stay by his side. He wouldn't want you to risk your life by searching for him, elf." Gimli spoke up by beside him, somehow knowing exactly what he was suggesting to do. "He would want you to stick with Theoden King. He would have wanted you to finish your mission." Yes, but what mission was that? He didn't understand his own mission. All he knew was that he had to follow Aragorn. Legolas nodded and turned away. He wasn't told what the original quest Aragorn, Gimli, and the 4 hobbits were on, but knowing Aragorn was Isildur's heir, he could suspect what it involved. If he was right then, Aragorn was needed. He couldn't be gone. He was important. If he fell, would the world of men follow? Helm's Deep was surrounded by large stone walls, towering over everyone, and casting a big dark shadow across the land. It was the first thing Legolas noted. He felt a familiar cold shiver down his spine. He paused for a brief second in trepidation. He had been lucky enough that men didn't build their homes and cities in mountains like dwarves. But, unlike elves, humans aren't as apprehensive about being in mountains. The fact that the top of Helm's Deep was opened only gave him a little relief. But, with the stone wall so high, it didn't feel open. If one add the crowd as well, it would be almost impossible for him to feel at peace and safe. He knew, as he approached the door with shaky legs, that he wouldn't be spending a lot of time indoors. He eyed the guards on the battlement, keeping watch. "You are looking uneasy, elf," Gimli grumbled with a chuckle. Legolas gave him a stony look, but remained silent. If being surrounded by tall stone walls wasn't bad enough, the noise made it almost unbearable for his sensitive ears. Children running around, mothers crying over lost husband, animals running, barking, neighing, soldiers stomping their feet in formation. He couldn't wait for this to end. He was already missing the wide open fields and the vast forest of Fangorn. Trees, life, air, freedom. "Oh, the Lady Eowyn," Gimli murmured sadly. Legolas glanced over and saw the women standing by her uncle. She was looking out into the men with searching eyes, looking for one that was not with them. He turned away from her. He left Gimli to deal with Lady Eowyn while he surveyed the grounds from the battlement. Walking along the wall helped him clear his head. He felt lost now without Aragorn. Aragorn gave him a purpose of being here. Legolas didn't know what to or where Aragorn had planned to go after this. Maybe he should just go to Mirkwood and find whatever family he may have there. He promised to stay with Aragorn, not stay with whatever mission Aragorn was on. He leaned against one of the crenellations and peered over the edge. He wouldn't go. He would feel too horrible if he had left. He wasn't heartless, by any means. He wouldn't leave Rohan to its fate. He stayed there most of the day, leaving only to rest on the cot offered to him. He barely socialized with anyone, keeping mostly to himself. No one bothered him. Not the guards, not the king, not Gimli. 2 days passed with the same monotone routine. He barely spoke to Gimli, but it wasn't as if the dwarf was searching for conversation with the elf. Legolas spent his days on the battlement, walking along the wall like a general watching over his men. No one seemed to mind his presence, much to his relief. "Rider approaches!" a guard yelled. Legolas immediately paused and turned to the direction of the yell. He rushed over to the guard and peered out across the plains. His elvish eyes quickly spotted the rider heading for Helm's Deep. The guards stood around him, waiting for his assessment. He saw the man's long hair, dark in color, his exhausted gray eyes. He pulled back in surprise. "It's Aragorn," he announced before leaping away to meet up with the man. "Open the gate for him," he shouted to the gatekeeper. Legolas headed to his sleeping cot to get the Evenstar necklace that rightfully belonged to Aragorn. Knowing Aragorn would most likely want to speak to the king, he decided to meet up with him near the throne room. He had just gotten to the steps outside the king's room when he saw Aragorn approaching quickly. The man stopped in front of him, and they stared at each other, taking in each other's appearances. "You stayed," the man noted. Legolas nodded. "I did, but thoughts of Mirkwood did tempt me so. I knew my place was here, for now. I made a promise." He looked Aragorn over. "You look terrible." Aragorn stared at him before chuckling in relief, glad that the elf decided not to leave. He clapped him in the shoulder in greeting. Legolas reached into his pocket. "You dropped something that holds your heart." He reached out and placed the necklace in the opened palm of Aragorn's hand. Aragorn glanced down at the necklace in wonder before lifting his surprised gaze to Legolas. The elf smiled at him. "Hanenle," the man said, gratefully. "Thank you." Legolas gave him a nod of recognition. "I must speak to the king. Find Gimli. He would want to hear this as well." Legolas stepped aside and allowed Aragorn to pass. Legolas stepped down the steps and found Gimli walking towards him. "Come, Gimli! Aragorn has news." He turned and headed into the king's room without waiting for the dwarf. He could hear the shorted figure huffing after him, complaining under his breath, but ignored him. "Speak with you urgently, King Theoden," Aragorn was saying when Legolas and Gimli entered the room. They moved into the room and stood next to Aragorn. There were only a few people present with the king, and they stood back against the wall by the throne chair, quietly listening. The king stood from his chair. "You have returned with news?" he questioned. Aragorn nodded solemnly. "Solemn news, I'm afraid. On my way here, I noticed a great host of Uruk-hai heading straight here from Isengard." Theoden stepped away from them in thought, his back to them. "A great host, you say?" Aragorn nodded. "All Isengard is emptied." "How many?" the king asked. Legolas caught the small tremor in his voice, fear for his people. Outwardly, he remained strong as any king. 10,000 strong at least, Aragorn answered. Legolas raised a shocked brow at the number. Theoden turned to face Aragorn. His face looked pale. 10,000, he questioned in horror. "It is an army bred for a single purpose," Aragorn started to say. Theoden eyed him, waiting for the answer. "To destroy the world of men." Theoden's eyes widened, and he glanced away. "They will be here by nightfall," Aragorn said softly, as if it would soften the blow. The king stood there and thought for a moment before turning away. He walked towards the door with heavy footsteps, a determined, stubborn lift of his head. "Let them come," he said stonily. He left the building. Aragorn glanced at Legolas and Gimli. "Come," he said, before following the king out. Legolas and Gimli fell into step behind him. "Gamling!" the king called out to his captain. Gamling quickly fell into step beside his king. "My king?" Theoden glanced around at his people. "I want every man and strong lad able to bear arms to be ready for battle by nightfall." Gamling nodded and left the king to follow his orders. Theoden walked over to the front gate and stepped out. Men were nailing more plaques to the door to strengthen it. Legolas eyed them before following the Rohan king and Aragorn on the causeway. Gimli followed behind him. He glanced back at the gate. "We will cover the causeway and the gate from above," he said, pointing to the battlement above them. He glanced around. No army has ever breached the Deeping Wall or set foot inside the Hornburg. "This is no rabble of mindless orcs," Gimli spoke up. Every eye turned to the short dwarf. "These are Uruk-hai. Their armor is thick and their shields broad." Theoden stepped in front of Gimli. "I have fought many wars, Master Dwarf. I know how to defend my own keep." Theoden walked past him and returned the keep before Gimli could utter another word. Legolas didn't know what to think of the king. He seemed confident he could hold his own against an arm of 10,000. Legolas wasn't so sure. He could feel the fear radiating off the people of Rohan. It was a suffocating fear, and the fear grew as news of the great host heading their way spread. Despite his misgivings, Legolas followed behind the others as the king led them to the inner bailey. "They will break upon this fortress like water on rock. Saruman's hordes will pillage and burn. We've seen it before. Crops can be resown, homes rebuilt. Within these walls, we will outlast them," Theoden said confidently. Legolas shook his head, not having the same confidence Theoden held. They do not come to destroy Rohan's crops or villages, Aragorn argued. They come to destroy its people, down to the last child. Theoden stopped and turned to face Aragorn. He got into the man's face, his fist holding onto Aragorn's collar. Legolas took a step forward, ready to defend Aragorn if the man needed it. "What would you have me do?" Theoden whispered angrily. "Look at my men. Their courage hangs by a thread. If this is to be our end, then I would have them make such an end as to be worthy of remembrance." He started at Aragorn before stepping away. He turned away from him and started to walk off. Legolas glanced around at his men, seeing their frail courage. Their eyes flickered around, scared of their own shadows, fearful of death. They would not make it past this night, he knew. It was death to them. "Send out riders, my lord. You must call for aid," Aragorn argued. Theoden immediately turned back to Aragorn and got back in his face. "And who will come? Elves? Dwarves? We are not so lucky in our friends as you. The old alliances are dead." Legolas couldn't believe the king wouldn't even try to take Aragorn's advice. What would be the harm in trying to ask for help? "Gondor will answer," Aragorn said. "Gondor?" the king questioned in disbelief. Where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? Where was Gondor when our enemies closed in around us? Where was Gon? He stopped mid-word and shook his head. "No, my lord Aragorn, we are alone." He turned and walked away. As soon as he was out of sight, Legolas stepped next to Aragorn with Gimli on the other side of him. Legolas shook his head. "You advised wisely, Aragorn. Do not put blame on your shoulder that he did not listen," he said softly. Aragorn nodded. "How could he not even try to ask for aid?" Gimli grumbled. "He needs all of his men here. He fears, even if he gets news of coming aid, they will be too late," Aragorn stated. The man looked weary with dark circles under his eyes, but he continued forward. He may be right. It could be a pointless endeavor. Those men he would send would have more use here. It wouldn't have hurt to try. They will need all the help they could get, Legolas said as he eyed the guards below them, gathering up the frightened people. Aragorn walked away, and the other two followed him. "Gimli, why don't you help people into the cave?" he suggested. "Meet us in the armory when you are done." Gimli nodded and headed off in the other direction. Legolas followed Aragorn as they stepped into the throng of people. They stepped around the women and children that were heading in the opposite direction, towards the caves. Voices were calling everyone into the caves. "Come on, people! Quickly, now! Move to the caves!" All around them, the guards were guiding the women and children to the caves. Legolas eyed the back of Aragorn's head worriedly as the man glanced up at the walls that surrounded them. The man had been up for hours, and he looked tired. He knew how fragile a human body could be. "We'll place the reserves along the wall," Aragorn was saying, pointing above them. "They can support the archers from above the gate." They started walking again. "Aragorn," Legolas said. Aragorn glanced back briefly. "You must rest. You're no use to us half alive." Before Aragorn could respond, if he intended to at all, someone called out to him. "My lord, Aragorn!" Éowyn ran towards them. Sensing he wasn't needed, Legolas held back. "I'm to be sent with the women into the caves." Legolas stepped to the side and helped support a one-legged elderly gentleman back to his foot. "Careful now," he whispered to him as he grasped the man's forearm. The older man gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you, lad," he said, his voice gruff with age. He grasped his wooden crutch and started to slowly follow the crowd towards the caves. Legolas watched him go with a raised brow. It was odd to be called a lad by a man much, much younger than him. It was one thing when Gimli did it. It seemed very different when a man did it. He touched the shoulder of a young lady. "Watch your step," he whispered as he helped her avoid a crack in the ground. The girl glanced at him gratefully. "Thank you, my lord," she said quietly before moving along. "Let me stand at your side," he heard Eowyn beg. He glanced over at the talking pair, waiting patiently. "It is not in my power to command it," Aragorn said before turning away from her. He started walking toward him. "You do not command the others to stay," she argued. Legolas turned back to helping the crowd flow calmly towards the cave. He stepped aside as a woman pushing a cart passed him. A bag fell off, and he quickly bent down and picked it up. "Miss," he called out. The older women stopped and turned to him. "You dropped this." Legolas placed the bag back on the cart. "Bless you, my lord," she croaked before moving forward. Legolas glanced up and stepped aside as Eowyn passed him in a hurry. He looked over at Aragorn. He just shook his head, refusing to comment. Legolas walked over to him and waited. "Gimli would soon be waiting for us in the armory," the man said before Legolas could ask. It was crowded in the armory. The Rohan guards were handing out weapons to the villagers. He could feel the fear, almost taste it in the air. The villagers looked down at their newly acquired weapons, as if they had no idea what it was or what to do with it. It was a foreign object to them. Legolas shook his head in disgust. This could hardly do. This wouldn't do. This was no army. There weren't even enough men to fight. The king should have sent for aid. There was no way they could win without help. Farmers, farriers, stable boys, Aragorn listed as he eyed the villagers around them. These are no soldiers. Most have seen too many winters, Gimli said, eyeing an older man. Legolas shook his head. Or too few, he said, as his eyes glanced past a young lad that couldn't be over 12 years old. Aragorn gave a slight nod in agreement. Look at them, Legolas said, not seeing the point of battling when there was very little chance of winning. They're frightened. I can see it in their eyes. He said the last part, a little louder, and the room grew silent. Their eyes were on them. Legolas stepped back and gave Aragorn a flat look. Bo ahin neld harain, Dan Kermenig, and they should be. 300 against 10,000. He kept his voice even, but hard. Aragorn glanced around the room, noticing everyone's eyes on them, and responded in Elvish as well. He stepped forward, keeping his voice low. Siberiathar hinamaig naned Edoras. They have a better chance defending themselves here than in Edoras. Aragorn, Menai Endagor, Hinu Ortheri, Natha Daged En. They cannot win this fight. They are all going to die. His voice raised a little as he spoke without conscious knowledge. Aragorn took a quick step forward. Then I shall die as one them, he yelled. They stared at each other, and Legolas felt the beginning of remorse for his despair. Aragorn turned and walked away. The crowd departed to make a clear path for him. Feeling guilty, Legolas stepped forward to follow him, but Gimli grabbed his arm. Let him go, elf. Let him be, he said softly. Legolas sighed and glanced around the room. Everyone was now staring at him. He turned and quickly left the room as well, to get away from their stares and their fears. Captain Irinion stood by the gate of the city of Mirkwood. His hand was firmly on the hilt of his sword by his side, and his ears firmly trained to the forest beyond. 4 guards stood behind him, their eyes focused on their surroundings, anticipating a possible attack. They had sent out several scouts to follow the band of leaving orcs a month ago, hoping to discover what the things were planning. Every day, guards were posted outside the gate to await their arrival. Captain Irinion stood watch this night. He had already been out here for a few hours, with nothing to report back to the king. It's been quiet, just like it has been for a while. Captain Arinian glanced up, seeing a few stars peeking between the leaves of the trees. It was a night like this when he realized Prince Legolas was not in his bedchambers. He remembered that night well. How could he ever forget when he was the last one to see the young prince? That day did not just haunt the king. The sight of the young elf sitting against the wall across the wooden door to his Edoras office painted a depressed portrait to Captain Arinian. Prince Legolas looked so young and haunted, just sitting there, waiting for his Edoras, his knees pulled up against his chest, his arms wrapped around his legs, his chin resting on the top of his knees, his eyes glued to the wooden door. This would be the 20th time Captain Arinian saw this sight. He approached the young prince and knelt down next to him. "Legolas, come." He held out his hand. "I'll take you outside. You need fresh air before sleep calls to you. Your Edoras would come out when he is ready, and you can give him the biggest smile you can when he does." Legolas tightened his grip around his legs and shook his head, his eyes never leaving the door. Captain Arinian dropped his hand and gave the elfing a pity look. "You can't stay out here all night, my young prince. It is not healthy." Legolas still refused to budge. Captain Arinian knew he could have simply picked Legolas up and carried him, but even he hoped King Thranduil would come out of his office. The captain knew King Thranduil needed his son at this time more than anything. So he left Legolas there, hoping the sight of his son would wake King Thranduil from his own pain and grief. When he walked by the king's office several hours later, he was happy to see that the prince was no longer there. It was late. The stars were out, the sky clear. He knew Legolas needed rest. He would make sure to check on the young prince after his rounds, just to make sure Legolas was sleeping well. It took another hour to finish his rounds. He went straight to Legolas's chambers and quietly opened the door. The room was dark, but the bright moon shone in from the window. Captain Arinian frowned at the sight of the empty bed. "Legolas?" he called out as he fully entered the room. A quick search in the chambers told him Legolas wasn't there. That was when he called for a search of the palace, but the young prince wasn't to be found. He had everyone abled elf search the city, but Legolas wasn't there either. With a heavy heart, he sent guards out to start searching the forest as he approached the king's door. He was dreading to disturb King Thranduil with such disheartening news, but he now knew Prince Legolas, son of King Thranduil of the Greenwood realm, was missing, and the king needed to be told. Captain Arinian felt responsible for the missing prince. The guilt inside him wanted to fester and grow, but his other responsibilities, like taking care of the fading king, had kept him grounded. He was the last one who saw the prince. He had the chance to make sure Legolas was asleep in bed, but he waited. Had he picked Legolas up and personally see him to his bedchambers, would Prince Legolas still be here? Had he went to check on the prince before doing his rounds, would they had found him before he gotten too far? He never told anyone of his guilt, letting them all focus their attention on the grieving king. "Captain Arinian," someone approaches, of his guard said, interrupting his wandering thoughts. Captain Arinian pulled out his sword, only to relax his hold. "It's Edoras, one of the scouts." Edoras limped towards them, his right arm bleeding heavily. His cheek was scratched. Captain, he said breathlessly. The guards rushed forward to support him before he was able to fall over. He groaned. Captain Arinian gave him a concerned glance as one of the guards studied his wounds. "A spider bite," the elf said in alarm. He glanced up at their captain. He was bitten by a spider. Captain Arinian's eyes widened, and he stepped aside to give the guards room to get to the gate. "To the infirmary right away," he ordered, knowing they didn't have long before the spider's venom killed the elf. The injured elf shook his head. My report," He started to protest. "Edoras, we must take care of your wounds first," one of the guards said as they rushed him into the gate. Captain Aranian followed. "Something dark is brewing in Rohan," the elf said breathlessly. "Give me the report later, Edoras," Captain Aranian said before turning to a passing servant. "Fetch a healer now. Spider venom." "Run," he ordered urgently. She nodded, her eyes wide before turning direction and rushing to get a healer. They continued to make their way to the infirmary, hoping a healer would meet them on the way. But they aren't going to Rohan, Captain. Edoras continued to say weakly. His head flopped tiredly onto the shoulder of one of the guards carrying him. Realizing he couldn't get Edoras to save his strength, Captain Aranian asked, "Where are they going?" "Don't know, Captain. Sorry," came the weak reply. "He's fading fast," one of the guards said in alarm. "Edoras, stay awake. Take him quickly to the infirmary. Report to me of his progress." "I'll give his report to the king," Captain Aranian said, knowing it was his duty. Despite wishing to stay and see Edoras well again, he rushed to the king's office, pausing outside the door as the mental picture of the young prince came to him, sitting across the door with a frown on his face. It was a mental picture that came to him every time he came to the king's office. The last time he saw the prince, it was imprinted into his memory. It haunted him. He shook it away and knocked on the door. "Enter." He entered and bowed to the king, who sat at his desk. "Report, Captain." He nodded. "Yes, Hirfwin." One of the scouts, Edoras, returned. He was taken to the infirmary for spider venom. A quick flash of concern went across King Thranduil's face. If Captain Aranian didn't know him as well as he did, he would have missed it. Very few knew how much death and injury affected the king. Over the years, King Thranduil had to shut out the pain, needing to appear strong and in control to his subjects. "His report?" the king asked. "He told me that there is something dark brewing in Rohan, but the orcs leaving our lands aren't heading there. He doesn't know where they are going. I suspect they are trying to regroup in Mordor. You suppose the enemy is preparing for the final battle?" King Thranduil guessed wearily. Captain Aranian nodded. "Yes, sire." He watched as King Thranduil's face closed off, and he knew he was thinking of his son. Captain Aranian's own thoughts shifted to Legolas as well. With the final battle for Middle-earth fast approaching, he couldn't help wondering if they would ever find Prince Legolas in time. King Thranduil would refuse to leave without him. He knew. It made him wonder if he, himself, would leave if given the opportunity. With his responsibility to the king and his guilt over Legolas, would he stay if given the option? "Thank you for the report, Captain. You are dismissed." Captain Aranian had no choice but to leave King Thranduil with his thoughts. The world trembles, and Helm's Deep waits just beyond the horizon. But tonight, let us pause, drift into sleep, and tomorrow the road will carry us further. Join me in the next part of the journey.